becoming a Catholic.
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping you?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. There's nothing like it up and down the dial. You won't hear it anywhere else. A specifically non-Catholic audience is really what we're looking for here, so that we can answer the questions that non-Catholics have at, bring to the party here. Because many people misunderstand or just don't get where the Catholic Church comes down on this particular issue or that particular policy, or why do we believe what we believe, why do we do what we do. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening outside of North America, we have a number just for you. Just dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply for some folks anyway. And of course, there's always good old email. You can email us 24/7, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer, Matt Kabinski our phone screener, Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook Live, well, by golly, we're streaming there right now, and you can just put that question of yours in the comments box. Either Jeff or Charles will shoot that to us here in Studio One. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing pretty decent, thanks.
Haven't had a lunch update in a while. What was on the docket today?
Well, I splurged today.
Uh-oh.
I went from brown to white rice with my beans and vegetables and fruit.
No, now see,
I was living on the edge today.
You really were. See, if you were here on the radio team, it would be something like a Crunch Grab Supreme from the new Taco Bell down the road. But that's not the case here.
No.
All right, very good. So here is an email that we received. This is from Terry. Could someone be oppressed by evil spirits without being possessed? Could somebody be oppressed without being possessed? What would be some signs of oppression? And could a person in the state of grace be oppressed or possessed?
Thank you. Appreciate the question. So the kind of the consensus among Catholic exorcists on this is affirmative. Yes, a person can have very negative experiences with malevolent spirits that could be, obsessive thoughts, compulsive thoughts, gross temptations, things of that sort, that definitely have demonic influence. St. Paul speaks about the spirit who's presently at work in the minds of unbelievers, indicating that, his understanding that temptation does have a demonic origin. It can become quite malevolent, and that falls short of absolute possession. Could a person in the state of grace be possessed? Again, and really we're looking to Catholic history for evidence about this, because this is not the sort of question that sacred scripture would answer directly. So we're having to lean on the discernment of practicing exorcists down through the centuries. I believe the consensus opinion on this is, yes, it's theoretically possible, but exceedingly rare. There have, in fact, been documented cases of demonic possession among people who were saints, among people who were very, very holy. And this happened for some inscrutable purpose. God allowed it for their sanctification and salvation, and maybe for the good of the church in some respect. It's hard to discern in the moment, but that's very, very rare. Most of the people who get demonically possessed typically have opened themselves up to it through some form of the occult or some sort of gross sin.
Can you give us like a real quick summation? What are we talking about when we talk about oppression and possession?
Sure.
So like a definition.
Demonic possession would be when an evil spirit actually comes in and controls the personality completely, right? Like subsumes your individuality.
Yeah.
Oppression would be a person who maintains their sense of self and control over their actions, but they are suffering egregious temptations, fears, anxieties of demonic origin.
Okay, very good. And thank you so much for that question. Here is one now from Sharon in Ohio. What is the Church's teaching on same-sex marriage? Our daughter is legally, quote, married to another woman. We do not recognize this as a valid marriage, but we would still like to maintain a relationship with our daughter. Where do we draw the line to still stay within the Church's teachings? Thank you, Sharon.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate the question. There are no square circles. There are no square circles. And so the Church's teaching, if you will, on same-sex marriage is that this is an oxymoron, because marriage, by definition and by metaphysical necessity, is the lifelong indissoluble union of a man and a woman for the purpose of raising a family in the normal way, the way babies tend to happen.
All right.
That's what marriage is. Now, if I really like my tennis partner, I really like him, and I say, we play tennis all the time, and this is a absolutely fantastic part of my life. Maybe the most meaningful thing I do in my life is play tennis with you. Let's call this relationship that we have, let's call that marriage. Let's just call it marriage. We're hitting a yellow ball back and forth across the net, over the net on this hard top. That's marriage. That is essentially what the gay marriage movement has done, taken a different kind of union, ordered toward a completely different goal, and said, hey, let's call this marriage. And they just don't know what the meaning of the word is, and they don't understand the purpose of the social institution. The purpose of the social institution of marriage is not to hallow or sanctify or somehow grant legitimacy to a form of sexual attraction, nor is it simply to bond two people together in sexual intimacy. That's not the purpose of marriage. The purpose of marriage is to create an institution in which children can be brought into the world, and the people who bring them into the world are the ones primarily responsible for their care and love and upkeep. So it is for the common good. It's not for the private good of the individuals involved. Marriage is for the sake of the common good of civil society, because it's the institution that replenishes society through childbirth. So it's just it's a gross category mistake to refer to these other sorts of relations as a marriage. Now, how to best relate to people who are in that situation, we can come back to that after the break.
Let's do that. So Sharon will continue to answer your question right after the break. And we'll also get to your phone calls at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion.
This is Conversations with Consequences, where we delve deeper into issues affecting our church, our country, and our core, the family.
As Catholics, we need to be informed, aware, and able to talk through some of the tough topics that we're facing in our culture and in our world. Conversations with Consequences gives us the tools to do so.
It's not enough to pray. We have to be a light for the world.
Conversations with Consequences, this Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
There's a saying, no good deed goes unpunished. That's certainly the case with Nebraska State Senator Julie Slama. On the first day of the legislative session, she introduced the Compassionate Heartbeat Act to protect unborn babies once their heartbeat can be detected in a doctor's office. Reactions from the extreme left were swift and utterly disgusting. Senator Slama received at least 9 death threats. There were also threats of rape and explicit comments not able to be shared here. But Senator Slama and her pro-life colleagues aren't wilting under pressure. As our nation moves closer to the possibility Roe v. Wade will be reversed or seriously impacted by the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling, pro-abortion activists are becoming more desperate, and that desperation is nearly as ugly as abortion.
Like us on Facebook at Life Issues and stay informed, more informed than you've ever.
Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on this Thursday afternoon. We understand that weather is pretty rough and certainly an enormous part of the United States, so please be careful out there. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. A little reminder here that EWTN offers the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass from Our Lady of the Angels Chapel live every morning at 8 a.m. Eastern, right after the Sunrise Morning Show. And to be sure that you don't miss out, we can send you a link to your email inbox every day. How about that? Visit EWTN.com and click on subscribe. Again, EWTN.com, click on subscribe. So, David, before the break, we were tackling this question from Sharon in Ohio. What is the Church's teaching on same-sex marriage? Our daughter is legally, quote, married to another woman. We don't recognize this as a valid marriage, but we still want to maintain a relationship with our daughter. Where do we draw the line to still stay within the Church's teachings?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So, St. Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, deals with a question of immorality within the Church. And he tells the Corinthians how to handle this problem in order to bring this individual to repentance and restore them to fellowship. And then he makes an interesting observation. He says, but I don't suggest that you do this with people that are not in the Church. Don't judge them. Leave them up to God. You deal with yourself and fellow people in your Catholic community, but I'm not. If you run around judging people outside the Church, you'll never do anything else, and you won't get anywhere. And I think that's a pretty good principle, right? That we're not really going to advance people, probably most of the time in their moral life, if they're set in their ways by just arguing and provoking them all the time. I think we'll make better headway by exemplifying the virtues that we would like them to share. And so by exemplifying charity and chastity in your own life and fidelity to your spouse and all those good familial virtues that you'd like your daughter to share, by exemplifying them with love, you'll go farther towards winning her back than by overt criticism. So, I think, she makes her own choices. She does her own living. You don't have to live her life for her. As long as you're not called upon to positively affirm those moral choices, through some sort of solemn act, then I think you're okay to be in relationship with her, and you should be, right, for the love's sake.
Sure.
I might draw the line. It sounds like she's already entered into this civil relationship. I'd probably draw the line at going to a civil wedding ceremony or something as if to solemnize that. I wouldn't do that. But in terms of relationship, yeah, I'd be in relationship.
All right, very good. And thank you so much for your email. And if you're ready now, let's open up the phone lines and go to 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin today with Jennifer in Oklahoma City, listening on YouTube today. Hi, Jennifer. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. I was wondering what the deposit of faith means as opposed to how many different things we can choose to follow or believe within the Catholic Church. What does it mean to just have a deposit?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So the deposit of faith refers to what Jesus is referring to in Matthew 28 when he tells the disciples, go into all nations, make disciples, and teach them everything I have commanded you. So all of the content of the faith in form and practice, word and practice that comes down to us from Christ and the apostles, whether in sacred scripture or by way of sacred tradition, that's what we refer to as the deposit of faith. Now, the deposit of faith is not self-interpreting. And so it is the job of the living magisterium of the Church to comment upon and to teach and to analyze and to define the contours of that deposit of faith. And sometimes the magisterium does so in a very solemn and public way, like, say, with an infallible declaration. Those things belong in a kind of, by extension, they belong to the deposit of faith because they're defining its content and meaning to us. So, for example, if Christ says, I and the Father are one, indicating his divinity, is one of the many passages in which Christ indicates his divinity. We take the words of Christ from the Gospel of John, but we also take the interpretation of that articulated at the Council of Nicaea, that Christ is true God from true God.
Okay. Jennifer, is that helpful for you?
Yes. I guess I just had one more question.
Sure.
Is it basically what is put forth in the creeds? Is that kind of the bare bones deposit of faith?
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think I understand what you're getting at. The creed is a summary of the main points of the Catholic faith. The Church understands the faith as possessing a kind of hierarchy of truths. Now, to speak of a hierarchy does not mean that if you're lower down the hierarchy, you're less true. It doesn't mean that. Nor does it mean you're less important. It means that the truths farther down the hierarchy are those that are entailed by the truths higher up in the hierarchy. So, to give you an example, let's say the Ten Commandments says, "Thou shalt not murder." All right? Well, don't perform abortions is entailed by the command, "Thou shalt not murder."
Yep.
You see what I'm saying? Like they're both absolutely true.
Yes.
One's entailed by the other. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, the highest truth in the hierarchy of truths is the existence of God. Everything else flows from that because the whole Catholic faith is meant to reconcile us to God. Without God, you have no Catholic faith. Now, Christ is the means of reconciling us to God. So he's the second point in the creed. God the Father Almighty and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. But then everything that Christ does to reconcile us to the Church, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Mm-hmm. One baptism for the forgiveness of sins. The whole course of Catholic liturgical practice and tradition is entailed by those major points, those major articles of the creed. So the answer to your question is yes, positive faith is summed up in the creed, but that doesn't mean that the only thing you have to believe is the content of the creed. You actually, as a Catholic, we need to believe everything that the Church declares to be revealed by God.
Okay. Appreciate that, and thank you so much for your call, Jennifer. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. Matt Kabinski, our phone screener, waiting to hear from you at 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Quick question from Steve in St. Louis. He wants to know, what translation of City of God would you recommend that I use? And that would be City of God by St. Augustine.
St. Augustine. Yeah, good question. I have, in my own life, I have sort of laid hold of the translations that I've got lying around. I've been less selective with City of God. Uh-huh. I think I've got that, those old Everyman's Library with the kind of brown hardbound covers.
Yeah.
I have an old Everyman's Library edition of the City of God. I'm far from saying that it's the best one. I know Penguin Classics. I really like Penguin editions a lot, so that would probably be a really good one. But the reason I've spent less energy thinking about the proper translation of the City of God is that I read it a lot less frequently than I read the Confessions. It's a pretty cumbersome work, the City of God.
Okay.
I remember when I was in graduate school and I was doing a reading course on Augustine, and my graduate advisor said, let's do City of God, but don't read the whole thing. And I went and read the whole thing, and I came back, and he was like, "You read the whole thing? Oh, my gosh."
That's funny. All right, very good. Steve, thanks so much for your question. Trudy's watching us on Facebook this afternoon. Trudy says, "I am Catholic, and I lost my daughter on December 2nd, 2020. My daughter-in-law would not come to my daughter's funeral. How can I forgive her and my son who allowed her to show a lack of respect for us?"
Wow, I am so sorry. What a horrible thing to have happen to you.
Yeah.
How terrible to lose your daughter and then to have the pain compounded in this way. My heart goes out to you. I'm so very sorry. So, I'm sympathetic to how difficult this is. And I think it's important to realize that forgiveness does not mean that you suddenly have to stop hurting. All right? And forgiveness doesn't mean that the sight of your daughter-in-law or the memory of the event doesn't traumatize you. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're, presently engaged in a open, mutual relationship, because the other person in a relationship could make that impossible. I think forgiveness means that you are willing to enter into a loving relationship with that person at such time as that becomes a real possibility. Okay. And there's obviously something going on there, right, that needs to be fixed. I mean, there's some animus, there's some lack of compassion, there's some rancor there that I don't know about. in the daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
And that may be an impediment to your being in relationship with her, irrespective of the question of your forgiveness. And you're not obligated to sign up to get hit in the head by a hammer, if you follow me. So you have to ask God for the grace, and I think that it's okay that you hurt. You just have to be willing to want what's good for her, your daughter-in-law, and to be willing to be in that kind of loving mutual relationship at such time as it becomes possible.
Really appreciate hearing from you today, Trudy, and we're very, very sorry for your loss. Let's go back to the phones now at 833-288-EWTN. Here is Frank in Sherman, Texas, listening on the great Guadalupe Radio, AM 910. Hey there, Frank. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hi. Thanks for taking my call. I have a question. It's RCIA related. Teaches that if you're baptized in a Protestant faith, you do not get rebaptized or baptized a second time in the Catholic faith. Does that hold true for confirmation as well?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. I want to add one qualification to your statement about baptism. A valid Protestant baptism does not have to be done correctly, another time. Increasingly, Protestant denominations, and especially mainline Protestant denominations in the United States, and I'm thinking here about United Methodist Church, Presbyterian USA, Episcopal, that those kinds of denominations, the sort of classic, go back to the Reformation denominations. Many of these have changed the baptismal formula and no longer baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so if that is the situation, if a mainline denomination Protestant baptism baptizes someone, say, for example, in the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier, that's not a valid baptism.
Yeah.
And so someone entering the Catholic Church would need to be absolutely baptized. If there is a question about the validity of a Protestant baptism, then someone who wants to become Catholic can request a conditional baptism. Because if there's a valid baptism, you don't rebaptize, period, end of paragraph. Sometimes there's a question. Was it valid? Was it not valid? We're not really sure. Then you have what's called a conditional baptism. But if it's not a valid baptism, then one has to be absolutely baptized as a Catholic. Now, the same is not the case for confirmation, because confirmation has to be performed by the bishop or his delegate, a priest to whom he's given faculties to perform the sacrament of confirmation. And other denominations, Protestant denominations, don't have validly ordained bishops. They lack apostolic succession. And so since they don't have validly ordained bishops, they don't have anyone who has the faculty of being able to celebrate confirmation validly.
True that. Frank, thank you so much for your call this afternoon. Call to communion here on EWTN. We have a line available for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. And speaking of confirmation, just heard from, looks like Deborah, watching us on Facebook in South Africa. Deborah says, why does the Catholic Church not recognize the confirmation sacrament of the Anglican Church?
Yes, well, we just touched on that one, didn't we?
Sure did.
So it's because Anglicans do not have valid priestly orders. They don't have validly ordained bishops with apostolic succession, which is necessary for the valid conferral of the sacrament of confirmation.
All right, there you go. Thanks for listening to us in South Africa. Here's an email from Liz who says, Dr. Anders, my husband attended his Presbyterian Church Bible study. His pastor said, the Holy Spirit is of female gender, as there is a reference to that in Proverbs. Well, I'm Catholic, and thanks to the Catechism and shows like yours, I know that's false. Please help me provide an appropriate argument to counter this. Thank you, Liz.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the question. So there are passages in the Old Testament that refer to the Spirit of God or to wisdom using a feminine article. That's true. Now, these, however, are their metaphorical language. I mean, there's God is compared to a mother chicken in the Old Testament. He's a hen who gathers his faithful under his wings. God's not a chicken. He's just compared to one, with poetic language.
Yeah.
Now, strictly speaking, God doesn't have a biological sex. God is not male or female. And the reason, historically, that we refer to God as God the Father, there's a couple reasons for this. One of them is that it reflects a difference in our whole cosmology, the way we understand God's relationship to the created order. Because in many of the pagan cultures surrounding Israel, their view of the way reality emerged was more like the process of parturition, that of being birthed by a mother, and sometimes in acts of violence. So in the Enuma Elish, for example, from the Babylonian epic, great female goddess, I can't remember if it's Apsu or Tiamat, I think it's Apsu, who gets slaughtered and her belly is ripped open and they spread her bones out to make the firmament of the sky, this kind of business. And the relationship of a father to offspring is one step removed from that, as God is more transcendent to creation than is pictured in the metaphor of maternity or parturition.
Very good. Appreciate that. And stand by. Lots more straight ahead here on this edition of Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
If you have a few minutes a day, you can become an EWTN media missionary in your parish, in your community, or through prayer. Be a part of Mother Angelica's mission. Place your gifts and strengths in service to Christ and His Church by volunteering your time and sharing the eternal Word with the world. Visit EWTNmissionaries.com today. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Want to be notified when Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
You know something about that new commandment the Lord gave us? You know what it says? That I should love you as much as the Father loves Jesus. But it doesn't say anything about you loving me. How do you like that? He didn't say you got to go around loving somebody. He said, I have to love you as much as the Father loves me. He didn't say, now you're going to get a return of love. In fact, he said, if you do that, if you love those who love you, the pagans do that. If you invite somebody to dinner and hope they invite you back, he said, the pagans do that. You got to invite people to dinner who won't invite you back. They don't have anything to invite you for. See, God doesn't think the way we do. We're so far away from the way God thinks.
For more information on Mother Angelica, visit Religious Catalog at EWTNRC.com.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, we've got Jimmy Aiken for 2 hours of open forum. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion.
Hey, what's keeping you from becoming a Catholic? Think about that, pray about it, and then give us a call at 833-288-EWTN. A little full disclosure for you here. The phones are a little on the light side today. So if you call right now, we can probably get you in on today's show. 833-288-EWTN. All right, David, we do have another question standing by, but it's actually getting screened by Matt even as we speak. Let's do this email here real quick from Shane. Dr. Anders, I think it's wonderful that the Catholic Church has so much history and tradition. I am wondering why history and tradition are not found in the Protestant Church as well.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question. Well, actually, I think the Protestant Church is just absolutely, completely up to its eyeballs in history and tradition. But it's that the history and tradition are conceived differently and have a different function within those traditions. So I'll give you an example. I think it's kind of the primordial example. Martin Luther propounded the idea that we are saved, we are justified by faith alone.
Mm-hmm.
And he claims to have found that teaching in the writings of St. Paul. Now, the funny thing is, for 1,500 years, no one throughout the world, anywhere in Christian history, came to the conclusion that Paul taught that. And I don't think Paul teaches that. And lots of modern biblical scholars don't think Paul teaches that. But Luther, for idiosyncratic reasons of his own, came to that conclusion. And since Luther, virtually every Protestant has agreed to hold Luther's interpretation of St. Paul as normative. And it is all but dogmatically defined, if you will, within Protestantism, that one must read St. Paul in this way. Now, that's a piece of Protestant tradition. That's clearly what it is. It doesn't emerge from the pages of the Bible. It emerges from the brain of Luther and is handed down by Protestant tradition. But and he functions as a kind of quasi-magisterium for them. But they don't recognize it in that way. What they assert is that part of the tradition is to assert that it emerges from the Scriptures. You see?
Yeah.
But there are traditions of interpretation that come to define Protestantism in general, and one Protestant tradition from another. So take another example. Luther also taught that Christ is truly and really present in the Blessed Sacrament. Ulrich Zwingli taught that he's not. And Calvin says he is and he isn't. And so we have actually three different traditions of Eucharistic theology within Protestantism emerging from these different theological centers. And they get continued and handed down in their respective denominations.
Wow. Thank you so much for your question. Let's go back to the phones now at 833-288-EWTN. Here is Jack in Yuma, listening on KYVD this afternoon. Hey there, Jack. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hi there. Yeah, I'm not Catholic myself, but I've been reading into the arguments for classical theology or natural theology. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the picture of God that comes out as a result of that is different in some ways from the picture of the Christian God, like specifically with regards to contingency. Mm-hmm. Like in natural theology, God is conceived of as not being composed of parts. So I'm wondering how that squares with the doctrine of the Trinity. Or to give you another example, there's the idea of the pure act, of act absent any potential.
Sure.
So God is without potential to be actualized. I'm wondering how that squares with the incarnation, because
Sure.
that seems to me to be an example of a potential being actualized in time.
Right. Yeah, sure. Thank you. I appreciate the question. Let me start with the second one first. The Catholic position is that God eternally enters into union with the temporal universe in the incarnation. So, in the same way that God eternally creates a temporal universe. So it's a relation, right, from our side, but it implies no change in God, because there's no before or after in God. Like, so to imagine that God was sort of sitting around one day twiddling his non-existent thumbs and then suddenly deciding to create a world and then later becoming incarnate in the person of Jesus is to misstate God's relationship with time. Now, there's a metaphor, there's an image, and of course it doesn't capture the reality, but it's instructive nonetheless, that we find in Boethius in his famous book, The Consolation of Philosophy, where he compares God's position vis-a-vis the universe to something like a king or a potentate who's sitting up in a stand watching a parade go by. And it's a poor analogy, but it's the best we can do. And from the point of view of the king, who's up 4 or 5 stories in the bleachers, he can look to the front and the back of the parade and see the whole thing in one permanent instant. Mm-hmm. Whereas to someone who's on the ground floor, so to speak, he just sees the succession of the lines of soldiers passing by in front of him. Now that's, of course, from the king's point of view, there's still motion. But I think the perspectival difference there can give you a sense of what's being claimed when we argue that God eternally creates or is eternally incarnate in a temporal human nature. When it comes to the doctrine of the Trinity, again, these relations imply no change in God. We speak of the second person of the Trinity eternally begotten. It's specifically claimed in the Creed. He's not begotten in time. He's begotten, not made, and it is an eternal begetting. Now, again, an analogy only. Saint Augustine suggests that we think of the Trinitarian relations like an intellect eternally thinking itself. And so you have a subject, who does the thinking, the object, the thing thought, which in this case is reflexively the subject. Uh-huh. and then the act of thinking. Now, if you can conceptualize that in a permanent relation, then you have a weak analogy for what the inner life of the Trinity is.
Okay. And is that helpful for you, Jack?
Can I just ask for a point of clarification?
Sure.
Am I incorrect that the arguments for natural theology, they would say that God is not composed of parts?
Correct.
And yet the Christian Trinity...
yes. Sure. Yeah, so the Catholic doctrine is that the Trinitarian relations are not metaphysical parts. They're not parts. There's one substance, one essence, one thing in the Godhead. And so the paternity, filiation, and spiration are relations, but they're relations within a single subject, within a single essence.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. Jack, thank you for your phone call. Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. And we go now to Kevin in Rockville, Maryland, listening on the great Guadalupe Radio. Hey there, Kevin. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I was wondering, so I often see lay people giving blessings that only priests are normally supposed to give. I wanted to ask, are there any circumstances, because I've heard different opinions on this, I know normally layperson's not supposed to give the kind of blessing that priests give, but is there any kind of blessing that a layperson can give that's actually efficacious, that confers grace?
Okay, thanks. Thank you. I appreciate the question. So there is in the ritual, in the Book of Blessing, if the most recent edition, if my memory serves me correct, and I'm not a priest, so I don't own one, so I'm just doing this from what I've read.
Mm-hmm.
There are blessings that are indicated that parents can perform for their children and for their household. But there is something special about the priestly blessing. It is a sacramental in the Catholic Church that is specifically connected to the sacrament of ordination, because the priest operates with a kind of jurisdiction in the spiritual realm that lay people don't have. And so the other sacramentals in the Church actually rather proceed off of ordination. Think about the way, a priest might bless somebody's rosary,
mm-hmm.
and then you might possess the rosary as a kind of sacramental, but it's derivative on the priest's priestly blessing. A really good book on the theology of blessings is by Stephen Rossetti, entitled The Priestly Blessing, Rediscovering the Gift. Now, when you speak about conferring grace, the sacramentals do not confer grace ex opere operato the way the sacraments do, by the very working of the work. Okay, that's not the way they function. Now, we can encounter God's grace through the use of sacramentals, as these are signs that can also draw us into the orbit, if you will, of the intercessory power of the Church. But they don't work automatically the way the sacraments work. So they can be occasions for grace in our life. But there's no blessing that if I performed the parental blessing over my family, that doesn't automatically convey grace or confer grace upon my children necessarily. It might, through God's almighty power and His choice and our charity, but not necessarily, not ex opere operato like the sacraments.
I'm, as you're talking about all this, I'm recalling when I would give our son a blessing. When he was a young boy, he loved it. Just absolutely loved it. And it was a wonderful thing for our family. Appreciate your call there, Kevin. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Don't forget to join us for Divine Intimacy Radio. It's a great program we bring to you each and every Sunday morning, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. This week, Jordan Burke talks with Dan Burke, talking about his ministry, Do the Harder Thing, and also how he overcame addiction. A great program. Do check it out. Sunday morning, 6:30 a.m. Eastern. It's Divine Intimacy Radio right here on EWTN Radio. Will is driving through Illinois, listening on iHeartRadio. Hey, Will, what's on your mind today, sir?
Oh, well, hey, thanks for taking my call. I'm calling in just because I was baptized in, I can't even remember, but a Congregationalist church when I was a kid. And I've always really liked the Word and the Bible, but I've just been very inspired by the church lately. And my girlfriend was raised in South Louisiana, so she was baptized Catholic, but wasn't really brought up in the church. So I'm glad to say that I've brought her to the church, and we're hoping to get married in a Catholic church sometime soon. And I guess I just really say what I really appreciate about the Catholic Church is the authority. I've always kind of had problems with authority in my life, and I'm glad to say I recently became a truck driver. So I'm a truck driver. So my question is, my girlfriend and I were going through RCIA, but then I got a truck driving job, and so it's hard for me to participate in RCIA, if you see what I mean. So I don't really know how to get confirmed as a Catholic, and I was just wondering if you all might have
I got you, Will. I've got you. Not a problem. Not a problem. You've come to the right place. I'm smiling from ear to ear at your question. It
Yes.
makes me so happy. What a good problem to have.
It
right?
is.
Okay. Believe it or not, Will, you are not the first truck driver to call me with this problem. I'll never forget Roy. And Roy, if you're out there, I hope you call us back one day and let us know how things are going. All right. First time this happened to us, Roy called us from the road, said, I want to be Catholic, but I can't consistently be at RCIA because I'm out on the road driving my truck. What do I do? I'll tell you what I told him, and it worked for Roy. Maybe it'll work for you. First of all, go let the pastor of the church know about your situation. State your positive intent to become Catholic, but the nature of your work prevents you from attending RCIA consistently. Can he make allowances for your case? And in Roy's case, I suggested that if the pastor is not able to instruct you directly, he might be able to appoint, say, perhaps a deacon, someone to whom he could delegate that responsibility, who would be willing to take on that responsibility for your instruction so that they can know that you have been taught and can affirm the Catholic faith. If you let the church know what's going on and ask them to work with you about it, I think you can find a workaround. I remember I told Roy that, and he called me back about a week later and said, I got my deacon. And then he called us after Easter when he had been received into the church. So now, also I would caution you, if at first you don't succeed, try again. So if you were to reach out and the parish, for whatever reason, says, well, we just got RCA, that's all we got, we can't do anything else for you, then I would walk down the street and I'd try the next parish. I mean, don't give up. If it doesn't work the first time, you try the second time. But we can make this thing work.
Well, thanks so much for your call. Good to hear from you. Be careful out there on the highways. Call to Communion here on EWTN. You remember, David, that at the beginning of the show, we got a question from Deborah. Deborah was on Facebook. As I'm scrolling up here, she said, why does the Catholic Church not recognize confirmation sacrament of the Anglican Church? She actually called back with a follow-up, and she says, why are Anglican bishops not recognized as correctly ordained? Is it because they don't answer to the Pope?
No, that's not why. I appreciate the question, by the way. It is possible to be a validly ordained bishop and yet to be in disobedience to the Pope or to be in schism from the Pope. That is possible. And sacraments performed by such a bishop can potentially be valid even though this person is not in communion with the Pope. So the issue with Anglicans is different. The issue is that when Henry VIII pulled away from the Catholic Church, he went into schism, so into disobedience with the Pope, but the bishops didn't stop being real bishops at that time, and the priests didn't stop being real priests. They were just priests in disobedience to the Pope. And they could have maintained apostolic succession and valid sacraments, and they would just be a schismatic church within the Latin tradition. That was a live possibility for Anglicanism until the reign of King Edward. And Edward was a young kid when he ascended the throne, and he had a lot of advisors around him, older men, who were heavily influenced by Calvinism. And through the influence of Calvinism, they imposed upon Edward, or they persuaded him, to change the rite of ordination in what was called the Edwardine Ordinal. And the language of the rite was altered to remove the doctrine of Eucharistic sacrifice and to change the fundamental meaning of priesthood as such within the Anglican tradition to conform to Calvinist theology. And so they actually vitiated their own orders and cut themselves off from apostolic tradition. It wasn't because of their disobedience to the Pope. It was because they vitiated the rite of ordination.
There you go. Deborah, thanks so much for your follow-up question. Appreciate hearing from you today. All right, let's go to Dennis now in New York, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hey, Dennis, what's on your mind today, sir?
I wanted to ask the host, how can we get the word out that Catholic men cannot join the Freemasons? I have so many Catholics I run into, they tell me they belong to a Mason lodge and whatever, and I look them straight in the face and tell them they're running the risk of being excommunicated, and they're shocked. They never heard that from the church. How do we get that word out? And thanks for all you do for the beauty of our church.
Well, I appreciate the question. I think this is a pastoral concern. And the principal responsibility for catechizing the faithful in their moral duty lies with the pastors of the churches. And I'm not surprised that that in Carmel, New York, that the most frequent topic for Sunday homilies is not "Don't join the Freemasons." It may be that a particular pastor is unaware of how many of his congregation actually belong to the Masonic Lodge. So it might be something you could bring to the pastor's attention. Say, we got like 8 guys in here that are doing this thing, and the church says, canon law actually says this is disallowed.
Yeah.
He may not be aware. Now, for our part on EWTN, this is a question or something like it that we get, I think, just about every week.
It's on a fairly regular basis.
Just about every week, somebody calls in and asks about Freemasonry, and so we always answer the question, and we go through the reasons why, and the canons on this, and it is definitely forbidden for Catholics to join the Freemasons. For what it's worth, I spent a delightful summer in Carmel, New York.
Really?
Yeah, many, many years ago when I worked actually at a fundamentalist Bible camp for kids.
Wow.
And I just had a great time up there.
Very cool. Thanks for your call.
Back when I was a fundamentalist Protestant.
Got it. Thanks for your call, Dennis, and for your kind words for the show. Let's go now to Andy in Michigan, listening on the great Ave Maria radio. Andy, what's on your mind today, sir?
How are you guys doing today? God bless. I found out that you can actually buy the Wycliffe and Dinsdale Bible still, which I was surprised because I thought they were in error. And then I read someplace that there's some Protestant circles that claim that the Tinsdale is the father of the English translation of the Bible.
Yeah.
Can you give me a little bit more information on it all?
Thanks.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the question. So Wycliffe was a 14th century English character whose theology was not the theology of modern Protestants. He, in many respects, his soteriology, that is his doctrine of salvation, was much more Catholic. He didn't believe in Luther's doctrine of justification, for example. But Wycliffe did have one very idiosyncratic belief. Wycliffe thought that if a man was not in the state of grace, of course, Protestants don't talk about the state of grace, but Wycliffe thought that if a man were not in the state of grace, that he could exercise no lawful jurisdiction, whether in the church or in the state. And so Wycliffe's doctrine was very socially revolutionary because he literally taught you don't have an obligation to obey a wicked ruler or a wicked prelate. Now, as much as I'd like that to be the case, it is not exactly the truth. And St. Paul teaches us that we have to respect every authority as ordained by God for the common good, whether that authority is personally wicked or not. And the position that, if I judge that you are personally immoral, I don't have to obey you, and your jurisdiction is null, chaos and anarchy would be the result. And so Wycliffe's contemporaries viewed him essentially as an anarchist and as a radical person. And his bones actually, I think, were burned in effigy or something right after the fact and tossed into the River Thames or something. He had some horrible thing like that happen because he was just seen as a revolutionary character. But as part of his anti-authoritarian bent, he also emphasized lay reading and study and preaching of the Bible. And so he was a promoter of vernacular translations of the Scriptures. Now, the idea that the English Bible begins with Tyndale, well, remember that the English language is really beginning around the era of of Wycliffe. I mean, we're talking about the time of Chaucer, and prior to the Norman invasion, there's no such thing as English in England. English is an amalgam that emerges out of French and Old Anglo-Saxon with a bunch of Latin thrown in, and so it's in a sort of an evolving thing.
It's a hot mess.
Yes, exactly. But vernacular translation of the Bible is as old as the Church. Both in England, we have Anglo-Saxon translations of the Bible produced by the Catholic Church in England, before the rise of the English language. We have French translations of the Bible. We have German translations of the Bible. So the idea that this is somehow the product of Tyndale, that vernacular translation, that's just patently false. Now, as English as a language is emerging in the late Middle Ages and early modernity, so is this anti-authoritarian, anti-clerical fervor that will eventually birth the Protestant Reformation. So in that particular historical instance, in, say, the 14th and 15th century, there is a lively debate within Catholicism about the role of vernacular translation of the Bible given its use by people like Wycliffe. And there was good evidence for the belief that vernacular translation is associated with revolutionary sentiment. And so there were differences of opinion as to what should the use of the Bible by lay people be. And that's, some of the opprobrium that the Catholic Church is held in today, Protestants will often say, well, they oppose the vernacular translation of the Bible. That's not true. But they had lively debates about it in a particular historical circumstances because of its association with political revolution. Okay. Tyndale borrows from Wycliffe's biblical translations in producing his own, and so he retained some of Wycliffe's errors. And he also opposed the divorce and remarriage of Henry VIII, so he wasn't popular with the Protestant monarch either, and everybody kind of had it out for Tyndale, Protestant and Catholic alike. He was eventually executed. He was assassinated, I think, in the Low Countries.
Wow.
But would I read their Bible translations? No, because they're not very good.
Okay, there it is. Andy, thank you so much for your call. We're going to go quickly to Marianne in Salina, Kansas, listening on Divine Mercy Radio. We have about a minute left here, Marianne. What's your question today?
I had a good friend the other day that asked me why, or I should say when, the Catholics had started such a great devotion to Mary. She said, as a Lutheran, she said, we honor Mary, but we don't go to her like the Catholics do. She said that's why Jesus came, so that we could go straight to him. And I just wondered if you could clarify that. I gave her some points.
Yeah, I've only got about 5 seconds to go. Devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary really begins in John chapter 2, when she intercedes with the wedding guests with Christ to turn the water into wine. And Catholics have been venerating the saints and the Blessed Mother for the entirety of the Church's history. The earliest Marian prayer outside of the Bible that we have record of is the Sub Tuum. We fly to your protection, O Mother of God. We have papyrus documentation of this from the 250s, around the time of the Decian persecution, but it's surely older than that in the tradition.
Goes way back. Appreciate your call, Marianne. Could not get to Dominic in Mansfield, Ohio, or Joseph in Henderson, Nevada, rather. If you folks would call us back tomorrow or the day of your choice, and just mention to our phone screener that we couldn't get you on today's show, and he will put you at the head of the line. Dr. David Anders, thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.
Don't forget, we do this program Monday through Friday right here on EWTN Radio, 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of our great team, I'm Tom Price. We will see you next time. God bless.
On the next Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo.
We do our very best at Catholic Connection to keep you connected to the Church with interviews on issues that matter, issues that impact our everyday lives as Catholics in the world but not of the world. Whether it's featuring the latest from the front lines of the pro-life movement or the culture